ODI's Development Progress Programme. And since I've been with ODI, I've been taking forward the team's work on women's economic empowerment. We recently launched a report, Women's Economic Empowerment, Navigating Enablers and Constraints, which I co-authored with an ODI colleague, Emma Saman. And ODI has also been closely involved in the high-level panel conversation throughout the year. We worked with the high-level panel secretariat to hold a consultation event in May, and we will be doing a parliamentary event in the UK Parliament in October. So, on behalf of ODI, I would just like to reach out to all of the panel members and just say, thank you for engaging us, and we look forward to engaging going forward. Just before I go any further, I would just say we've got a number of publications to the right of your screen, which should be available for download. The high-level panel report is there, as well as a number of other publications from our panelists, which we've mentioned today. And we will, of course, be tweeting throughout the event. It wouldn't be an event in the modern age without, of course, a hashtag. So please do tweet throughout the webinar using hashtag #EmpowerWomen. So let's move on to our panelists. Really warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. We have with us today Dr. Jeni Klugman, high-level panel report co-author and senior advisor at the World Bank, and also fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Women and Public Policy Programme. We have Jessica Woodruff, director of the UK Gender and Development Network, and we have Mekala Krishnan, engagement manager and co-lead on global gender equality at the McKinsey Global Institute. We're going to hear from each panelist with a short intervention before opening up this session to question and answers from you, the online audience. So what you can do now is submit your questions to the panelists using the chat function that you should see there on your screen. We will endeavour to take as many as we can, so please do keep your questions short. Please just bear in mind Please just do bear in mind that we are online a webinar. We don't, as a live event might be, we have a long time to kind of, give a preamble to your questions. We only have a very short time to do that. So please do keep your questions as short and to the point as possible, and we hope to be able to get through as many of those as we can in that way. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to our first speaker today, Dr. Jeni Klugman, who is my pleasure to introduce. I'm sure Jenny will be known to many of you, but for those who don't, as I mentioned, she's a senior advisor at the World Bank and a fellow at the Harvard Business School, and she is also co-author of this first report from the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. So Jenny, a really warm welcome again. Would you please take us through some of the key findings and recommendations of the report and possibly next steps going forward?
Okay, thanks very much, Abigail, and it's great to have the opportunity this morning, and grateful to the Overseas Development Institute for organising this opportunity. Just one small correction before we begin. I did work for the World Bank for 20 years, but I'm no longer affiliated with the World Bank. Pensioner, you might say, retiree. But with Harvard at the Kennedy School, I have an affiliation with George Washington University, where I'm a research professor, and various other activities. But in the short time I have now, I just wanted to run through a couple of the highlights in terms of the report itself, and just, I guess, in a sense, to give you a reader's guide. Obviously, in 7 minutes, I can't go much into the detail, but just to give you a sense of where we came out on different issues, and if you would like to dip in to the substance, which I hope you do, where you might turn. So the report itself is, of course, been launched last week. It's about 100 pages, organised around 4 chapters. The first is the motivation, why now? The second, where do we stand, and looking at trends and patterns over time, and drivers in what we see in terms of the empirics. The third chapter is very much a review of what we know about what works and what doesn't work to expand women's economic opportunities. And then finally, but not least, an agenda for action. And that commits to certain principles for action, and also lays out specific concrete actions that the panelists themselves, the 20 members of the panel, have committed to do in order to accelerate progress, as Abigail said, to kind of turbocharge the process. So we get beyond business as usual, which McKinsey and others have shown is not enough. So let me just highlight some of those areas within that kind of overall frame to call your attention. One, around the motivation and why now, just to that the case is very much motivated around the centrality of human rights, and that lack of equality is a breach of human rights. At the same time, there are important gains for development and for economies through expanding opportunities for women. And here again, we draw upon the work that McKinsey, the OECD and others have done. We also bring together the most recent evidence around the business case, why it makes sense, even from a selfish point of view, for businesses to be investing in economic empowerment. We have a visual which shows this in terms of the value chain. In terms of where we stand, again, bringing together the evidence that we have from around the world, highlighting that, for example, only half of women participate in the labour force compared to about 3/4 of men. Overall stagnation over time, that women are much more likely to do unpaid work than men, about 3 times as much unpaid work, and that's something which Nicola will be talking about, the persistent occupational segregation. So in that context, we identify what we see as being systemic constraints contributing to those outcomes, and they're summarised in Figure 1 in the overview, and in Figure 2.1 in the overall report. And we trace what for some of you will be quite well-known patterns in terms of labour force participation, in terms of access to assets, bringing together the evidence that we have. We have more recent evidence on, or new data on gender pay gaps, for example, which we've been able to draw on recent World Bank analysis on this preliminary results, which, unlike many other sources of data, actually adjust for hours, which is very important, and so give us a better measure of the size of the wage gap across regions. Looking then at kind of, if you like, the way forward, which is very important. We have a visual which is on page 4 of the main report, and page 4 of the overview. It's also in the PowerPoint presentation, which is available here, and it's the sphere, if you like, which shows this, what we call the 7 drivers around the outside, and then the 4 areas of work on the inside. So let me just kind of briefly list those, and then I think it'll be practically time for me to stop my remarks. The first, which came out as very much a recurring theme for women in all different types of work, whether they're working in the formal sector, whether they're in informal activities, women-owned enterprises, as well as in agriculture, is a centrality of norms and addressing adverse norms. And that came out very strongly from the work that ODI has done as well. So tackling adverse norms thus becomes kind of the priority in terms of the way forward. Associated with that, but of varying degrees of importance across countries, are legal constraints and legal discrimination, which constrain women's economic opportunities. Thirdly, and I guess the value add here relative to the work that you've probably seen from Women in Business and the Law and others is that we also look at the way in which laws constrain those working in the informal sector. So it's not just kind of private law in terms of property law and family law, it's also laws and regulations governing access to public space, for example, and municipal regulation. So it's a broader view on the importance of the legal sphere than is typically taken. Thirdly, and very importantly, and something that we'll be talking about in some depth in this webinar, is around the recognition, reduction and redistribution of unpaid work in care, which is a major theme in the report. Then around building assets, and here again it's a kind of somewhat broad perspective, so we're looking not only at financial access and financial inclusion, and here drawing on the work of the World Bank and others, but also digital access, because that's very much the way of the future, and digital inclusion and the gaps in digital inclusion, and Mekala and colleagues kind of brought together some good work for us in this area, as well as access to property, to land. And then so they're the kind of 4 prime drivers addressing systemic constraints. And then we look at kind of different sets of actors that are in a position to really drive change. And the first are, of course, businesses, so changing business culture and practice in terms of their own employment procedures, in terms of role models, in terms of kind of media and advertising. So there's specific things that can be done where business can play an important role, as well as their role, of course, in supply chains and ensuring against exploitation of workers in supply chains and outworkers and home workers and so on. Then we have the public sector itself. So beyond the role of government in terms of, for example, legal reform or extending access to childcare, the role of the public sector as an employer itself. So here again as a role model. The public sector is an important source of employment, particularly for women, in a number of countries. We have data that shows kind of the regional shares in the countries where it's particularly important, as well as their role as a procurer of goods and services and the ways in which programs to target, for example, women-owned enterprises to enable them to access opportunities can be very important. And then finally, but not least, the 7th driver is around kind of visibility and voice. And this came very strongly from the work of panelists, in particular WeGo, that works with informal workers, as well as the ITUC, the International Trade Union movement, as well as, of course, the ILO, which very much emphasised the work of the importance of collective organisation, collective voice and representation as a way of bringing together workers and enabling them to negotiate for better terms and conditions, to reform regulations which constrain their activities, stigmatise their activity, and allow for better outcomes. If I've run out of time, I'm happy to stop now, but I'm also, of course, here and happy to take questions as well. But I'd encourage you at least to dip into different parts of the report. Chapter 3 is the one which has evidence that we were able to bring together about what works across these different areas. We've got 50 pages of endnotes, so there's a lot of citations there for you to kind of follow up in different areas and dig deeper to be able to accelerate the agenda. But thanks very much, Abigail, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Jenny. That's great. Thanks so much for that overview. Hopefully that will have been a useful introduction for those joining us online who are perhaps less familiar with the high-level panels report. And if any of you out there have any questions you'd like Jenny to elaborate on any particular aspects of that, please do send your questions through to us. I think there was a couple of quite interesting things there, Jenny. One, as you quite rightly say, was the inclusion of unpaid work, unpaid domestic work and care. This was really a hard-won area within the SDGs, and it really is great that the report has prioritised that, and hopefully will galvanise a conversation on, what can be done in practical terms. And the same, I think, goes for the social and gender norms. The report really has a very strong focus on that, which is really weaved throughout, which is, I think, again, a very positive thing in terms of kind of hopefully galvanizing a conversation on what can be done. Otherwise, I think it's quite interesting that the report really kind of clearly identifies some key actors that should be or could be involved in implementing this and furthering the women's economic empowerment agenda. As you say, there's recommendations there focused on a couple of different kinds of groups of actors, and our own research here at ODI shows that it's a really kind of integrated approach of different sectors working together that's really going to push forward this agenda, and I think the report really does kind of touch on that as well. And I think, there's kind of a question there, one maybe we'll touch on later. This work is taking place within the kind of wider framework of the SDGs. And there's a question there really about, ultimately, how we're going to SDGs, and that governments worldwide have a responsibility ultimately for delivering. But, you know, all the way through the SDG conversation, there was really a feeling, you know, that actually it's about bringing in a range of different stakeholders, including private sector, including civil society. So, you know, hopefully this going forward in the high-level panel conversation, and today, if we want to get down into talking about how that could be done, you know, could really kind of boost conversation about how that could happen. So I'm going to move us on now to Mekala Krishnan. Again, it's, you know, really a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. Mekala is a fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute, where she's co-led on their gender research, including a report which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, The Power of Parity, How Advancing Women's Equality Can Add 12 trillion, yes, 12 trillion to global growth. So I hope that's the right bio. Apologies to Jenny for not having the right one. I do hope this time that is the right one. And I just want to, Mekala, can you give us your initial impressions of the high-level panel report? And perhaps say a few words and reflections about what the findings and call to action mean for your area, which is women in the private sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Abigail, and thanks to ODI for organizing the session. We're excited to be here and share our thoughts about the report. We also were fortunate enough to collaborate with Jenny and Laura during the course of writing the report, and we're very glad to share our findings and our perspective, both from the McKinsey Global Institute and the research we've done, as well as our kind of vantage point as a potential representative of the private sector. So I'll probably structure my remarks in three broad areas and try to keep to the time of 5 to 7 minutes that I have. But first, I would love to share some initial findings, initial reactions or impressions from the report, in particular how that ties back to our own research and what the report that Abigail alluded to, as well as other research, has pointed to. The second thing I'd love to talk about is the role of the private sector specifically, and Jenny alluded to that in her remarks, where she talked about one of the exhibits in the report that describes the business value chain, and I'd love to describe that a little bit more and how we see that playing forward. And then lastly, just some very initial thoughts on how the high-level panel could take this work going forward. I know there's a plan for a second report next year, and some building off, Abigail, some of the remarks that you just made, some initial thoughts we had on ideas for that new piece of work. So firstly, just beginning with my initial impressions of the report. So as I said, we collaborated with Jenny and Laura quite closely with the report, and there were many themes that the report touched on which aligned very closely to our work, and we were very happy to see included and described in the report. I think one, just starting out with the case for change, framing that not just from a human rights perspective and really starting there from a human rights perspective, but then also from a development perspective, from a mandate for inclusive growth, as well as then the business case perspective. We thought that was a really wonderful way to frame why people should care about this issue, and also bring multiple stakeholders that have different incentives or different interests in this space to the table. I think that was a great framing to start the research report and to start bringing multiple different stakeholders to the table. The second piece that we really appreciated was the broad definition of work, and we've talked about that a few times on this conversation already, not just thinking about the world of paid work, but also the world of unpaid work. As Jenny mentioned, women do about 3 times the amount of unpaid work globally as men. Our research has also found that in countries that have high levels of gender inequality in work, these areas also tend to have high levels of gender inequality in unpaid care. The two go hand in hand, and really tackling one requires tackling the other rather than addressing these two issues in silos. And then some of our work with the corporate sector and the private sector and looking at women within the 4 walls of companies has also shown that this dual burden that women face of work in the home as well as work in the workplace is really one of the key barriers to women progressing in leadership positions. So we feel that this is the issue of paid work as well as unpaid work are important to tackle hand in hand, not just for increasing participation of women in the workforce, increasing women's economic empowerment, achieving the 12 trillion opportunity, but also enabling women to proceed through the pipeline in corporate leadership and getting to some of the leadership positions, whether it's C-suite or board positions. The other piece around interventions and focus areas, which really our work highlighted and we saw reflected in the findings of the report as well. We found 4 areas that were really catalytic to driving progress in gender equality in work, as well as gender equality in society. And those 4 areas were unpaid care work, which we've already talked about, financial and digital inclusion, legal protection, and education. These were 4 types of gender gaps that our work showed were particularly catalytic to driving progress and change. And we found all of these 4 areas reflected in the report, reflected in the exhibit that Jenny spent some time walking us through. And then lastly, just around interventions and areas of focus, I think the other piece that Jenny didn't mention, but we saw alluded to in the report, was around violence against women. And we thought that was a great addition because what it enables the reader to take away is that you can't just think about the world of work in isolation, and gender equality in work and in society are closely linked, which was, again, one of the core findings of our work. Lastly, just quickly on intervention, some of the themes that Jenny highlighted as well, but themes around interventions that really stood out for us. One, beginning by placing women at the center of this debate, women as the core stakeholder, core constituency, women as agents of change, and that was a theme that stood out loud and clear in the writing of the report. The theme around partnerships, which I will come back to, but I think, again, really stood out as important to accelerating change, turbocharging change, as Abigail described. The importance of engaging men. And then finally, this theme around data and evidence. And I think just coming out of UNGA Week last week, the theme around data and evidence, just more broadly around the SDGs, is one that many people were excited and talking about. We know Melinda Gates has committed the $80 million to gender data and evidence. And that was, again, a theme that really stood out in the report, and one that we know we need renewed focus and attention around. So briefly then, hitting upon the role of the private sector, our work, as well as the work of the high-level panel, has really highlighted, I would say, 3 or 4 different areas that the private sector can play in. I think one is certainly the role of the private sector within its 4 walls, what private sector companies can do to advance, to better recruit, retain, and promote women. The second is the role of the private sector in enabling women in their supply chains and distribution channels, whether it's working with suppliers that in turn have policies that favor women, or enabling women-owned businesses to sourcing from women-owned businesses. I think we know that in many parts of the world, the formal economy is such a small part of the overall economy, and I think the only way that large corporations can help benefit a large pool of women is through looking at women in supply chains as well as distribution channels, and I think that was, again, a theme that came out loud and clear in the report. The role of the private sector through the products and services that it offers, and how the private sector can better serve women as customers. And part of this could also tie back to what the private sector can do on data. Large tech companies that are great at gathering data, great at data visualization, what they can do to help better improve gender data and gender evidence. And then lastly, the role of the private sector in philanthropy, in corporate social responsibility, and as being really advocates for change. Our research has repeatedly highlighted that change really happens within private sector companies when the CEO of the company, leading management in the company, is really behind the issue of gender parity and are loud advocates for change. And I think that all of these aspects of the role of the private sector came out loud and clear in the report, and I think have provided a great roadmap for the private sector on how they can look to intervene and look to drive change in this space. I know I'm probably very close to my time or at it, so just very briefly, and we'll probably touch upon some of this in the Q&A, just some thoughts on how the high-level panel could take this work going forward, and themes maybe to explore in the next report. I think clearly this report laid great groundwork on dimensionalizing the issue, on creating a case for change, on laying out an agenda for action. I think going forward, as Abigail, you were describing, I think some discussion or commentary or just guidance to readers on how to link Goal 5, which is equality, into the broader suite of SDGs, and help stakeholders therefore better prioritize both interventions in Goal 5, but also interventions across the SDGs, I think will be quite valuable. And creating a roadmap that enables them to do that, or a toolkit that enables them to do that. Just understand if for every incremental dollar or incremental hour that they're putting towards this, how do they think about priorities across the SDGs as well as within Goal 5? The second piece is more on the macroeconomic policy perspective. Our work has highlighted that bringing more women into the workforce, improving gender parity could add $12 trillion with a T, to global GDP, but that will require investments from the demand side as well to create jobs. So again, some guidance to stakeholders on how they could look to spur job creation, what are the nature of sectors and occupations and supply side skills training that they need to do. What is the magnitude of the investment that is required, and how can they think about innovative ways to secure that investment, whether it's tax policy on the part of governments, innovative public-private partnerships, social impact investing, whatever that may look and feel like. And then lastly, I think we've talked about this idea of partnerships, and I think it's tri-sector or cross-sector collaborations are increasingly being talked of, and there's increasing energy around all of them. But I think what would be great to see in the next report is examples of cross-sector collaborations and potentially even cross-sector collaborations across the high-level panel. We at the McKinsey Global Institute are excited about exploring this, and we are, through our local offices around the world, starting to have conversations with stakeholders about establishing coalitions for change that are cross-sectoral in nature. And it would be great to highlight in the next report, if that is feasible, an example of how to think about such a coalition, how to create shared values for the constituents of that coalition, and what you might be able to achieve from such a coalition that the individual players cannot. All right, Abigail, thank you, and apologies if I've gone over on my 5 to 7 minutes.
No, thank you. Some really great stuff there. Thanks so much for that overview. Both of your own work, which I think will hopefully be useful to those watching, those joining us who have heard of your report but perhaps not so sure about what it said. And I think and a really important thing that you highlighted there, which also comes through in the report, is that saying there are links across SDG 5 and then across the wider SDG framework as well. For example, you mentioned Borg and women's leadership. These are all really core issues that are not isolated from each other. So taking that really kind of holistic approach, I think is certainly of interest going forward. And it's good to see the high-level panel and yourself as an actor involved in this going forward, picking that up. If I could just make one brief reflection, I think whatever really take from what you're saying is that McKinsey is already really kind of thinking about practically, what you can do to take this forward. And one of the things that I thought, was really interesting, and we've already in the short space of time today heard this a few times, this idea of cross-sector collaborations. And it just kind of makes me reflect, and it's quite a personal reflection, but it's just about how do we do this in practice. We know that in a lot of development, conversations about how to take forward collaboration may happen, for example, within the remit of already existing program arrangements, etc., between, say, a donor and a program implementer. So there's a really question about, how really practically do we create space in country and certainly within different contexts within country for the kind of dialogue about how to take this forward between stakeholders, and actually always creating space is in itself not always cost and time neutral. So actually, how do we really foster these kind of dialogue for a shared understanding of how to take the agenda forward is certainly kind of something that comes to my mind. And just from what you've said there, really kind of makes me think about, okay, practically, how can we do this? It's great that there's an energy behind it. So I just think it's interesting to kind of think about how we do that going forward. So thanks so much for raising those issues. I'm going to move us on again now to Jessica Woodruff. Jessica is the director of the UK Gender and Development Network, which is a UK-based membership network of members working on gender development and women's rights issues. Jessica, thanks so much for joining us today. Really warm welcome. Could you give us your initial reflections on the report and possibly a few thoughts about next steps?
Okay, thanks, Abby, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I wanted to start just with a few overall points on the report, to then look at what I think are some of the good and important areas, and then finally to look at some of the future challenges, as weaknesses are often expressed in school reports. I should just say as well, apologies that you can't see me. I'm working from home and I don't have a webcam, but given the state of my house, it's probably just as well. So just to start off, overall, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's actually really important to have both the panel and the report focusing on women's economic empowerment in relation to the SDGs. Gender equality is an issue that is often lost within the SDGs, and women's economic empowerment or economic justice is often lost within gender equality. So I think in and of itself, the panel and the report are important. I think it's also important that there are representatives from the IMF and the World Bank on the panel, that we bring those institutions into this conversation. Given the very broad composition of the panel, CSOs, corporates, unions, IFIs, in fact, I think a lot of people had quite low expectations of what the report was going to come out with, and a fear that it was really going to be a lowest common denominator. And I recognise that it's probably a very difficult job for the Secretariat in balancing those different demands. And I think that given all of that, actually, it's really good that the report didn't focus on the lowest common denominator. And there's all sorts of good nuggets in there. Perhaps not surprisingly, I think then when we come to the call to action, not all of those good nuggets are perhaps reflected. But anyway, turning to the good areas. As I think the other two have also said, I think it's so important that the focus of the report goes far beyond the kind of discussion around microcredit, which has dominated the discourse around women's economic empowerment for so long, and looks at fundamental barriers. We've mentioned social norms and we've mentioned unpaid care. I think both of those are absolutely critical. And really, for the Gender and Development Network, given our work up until now, it is that recognition of the central role of unpaid care in women's inequality that is perhaps a major breakthrough of the report, but that's now firmly on the table. And the recognition, as Mekala said, that unpaid care work is actually work. The third good area, I think, is the focus on labour rights. Very clear recognition that unpaid care work, very clear recognition that women's collective action, both informally and through trade unions, is vital. The report reasserts the rights to freedom of association and of collective bargaining. Really important things to have stated in a report with such a wide membership. I think interesting also, the report mentions that adequate minimum wages are crucial in reducing the gender pay gap. And I think that's another mistake that is often made, is that we assume that measures to promote gender equality have to look specifically at gender, when in fact adequate minimum wages affect both men and women, but will affect the gender pay gap, reducing the gender pay gap. Also, mention of social protection is really important. So there's lots of good bits in there. Something on the importance of public spending for gender equality too, and as Mekala mentioned as well, mention of violence. Then finally, there are the 7 guiding principles, and there's a lot to be said about these as well. But you've got focusing on women at the base of the pyramid, although I'm not quite sure why at the base of the pyramid. Why not poorest and marginalized? But anyway, a focus on women at the base of the pyramid. Ensuring women's voice and participation is central to all actions. Equal focus on rights as well as economic gains. Tackling the root causes and respect for human rights agreements and labour standards. Those are all really important principles to have in the report, I think. But so moving on inevitably to the future challenges. The first one is that I do think that the call to action as it stands now doesn't really reflect many of the more progressive points in the report. There's a danger in the call to action that it's quite siloed, that there's a kind of pick and mix, whether it's for governments, for business, or for CSOs, but really it's more pick and less mix. There isn't really a cross-reference of what governments could do, for example, in regulating business or in supporting CSOs to work with women's rights organisations. The second sort of area of challenge that I wanted to point out to was coming back to the 7 principles and their excellent aspirations. I think more is needed here to follow through on that. So despite the title of the report, Leave No One Behind, I think there could be more focus as we go forward on women who are in poverty or marginalised. There's really not a lot to suggest that it's written from a human rights perspective or to put the voices of marginalised women at the centre. I think one of the issues here may be that the report tends to use research from the big, well-funded institutes like McKinsey, rather than some of the good enough research that's coming out of really quite small women's organisations. And it would be great to see a bit more of that going forwards. Also, in terms of tackling the root causes, again, it was great that that was there as a principle, but and it's great that social norms and unpaid care are discussed, but there is very little discussion on the broader macroeconomic causes of gender inequality. And my final point in this section is that I think there was an opportunity missed to really state that women's rights and gender equality are important for their own sakes. I think really that a panel like this, the primary power of a panel is not just to follow existing agendas, but to shape future agendas. And I understand that the report is speaking to those who need to have the business case made for women's economic empowerment. But I hope that going forward, we can see the panel being a bit bolder and a bit braver on actually just stating that women's rights are important for and of themselves, regardless of the business case. And so my final challenge, I think, here is really the most fundamental problem, and Mekala mentioned this, which is that really the report shied clear of addressing macroeconomic policy and the role of governments within economic decision-making. It's almost as though gender equality can be achieved in isolation from the economic context in which women lived. And I did think this was perhaps a bit surprising, given that UN Women's latest progress report, the UN Women's flagship report, really focuses on macroeconomic policy and gender equality and has a wealth of information there that could have been used. There's 5 areas really that I wanted to pull out on that. The first is on unpaid care, where the focus is quite a lot on the role of fathers and on getting women back into formal employment, and not really enough on public provision of care services. On labour rights, there's really not enough about creating jobs in the first place or about how labour rights will be enforced. There's a fairly glaring omission around creating fiscal space to provide the necessary resources for funding gender equality. And it did seem odd that there wasn't more on fiscal policy. And this is relevant for businesses as well as governments, in that the best thing that corporates can do, really, is still to pay their taxes and to stop lobbying for tax cuts. And that takes me on to the 4th point, which is that there's very little on government regulation of corporations. There's a lot of focus on best practice, which is great, but that's not going to eradicate the worst abuses. And then my 5th point on this is that in the call to action, governments commit to the old adopt macroeconomic policies to boost short-term and long-term inclusive growth. I just think you can't actually put this in to a report about gender equality without unpacking what's necessary to achieve growth, inclusive growth, in a way that promotes gender equality. And so going forward, I'd like to see a lot more of that from the panel. So just in conclusion, I think there's all sorts of good things in here. A lot of them aren't reflected in the call to action. But I think more importantly, the real power of a panel like this is in shaping future agendas. I think by putting social norms and unpaid care on the table, that's been started, but I'd really like to see macroeconomic and fiscal policy put on the table within the context of debates around gender equality. And I'd like to see a really clear statement moving forward from the panel that women's economic empowerment and gender equality are important as and of itself, and that no business case is needed in order to justify their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks so much for that very clearly, for those very clearly laid out points there. Obviously, I'm not going to repeat what you've just said. I think you made listed your points very clearly. But I would just kind of pull out that there's a few things that immediately jumped to me there. One is about the need to look more broadly at the macro. So this is really kind of getting right down into some of the structural barriers surrounding women and work and women's unpaid work as well. You mentioned there around around, for example, job creation and fiscal space. These are really kind of deep-suited structural issues. So just to mention that you've really kind of made a call to the panel on that going forward. But there's another aspect there, and I wouldn't like to put the two in opposition, but you've also mentioned about how are we actually really going down to look at what's happening on the ground, and how are we going to check that we're hearing more from women's rights organisations and they're more organisations working on the ground going forward. And this is quite a kind of a practical agenda, and one which has been, I think, brought up quite a lot in the consultations for the high-level panel, of which they were held all around the world, and we heard a lot of the voices of women's rights organisations. So it's really kind of question about practically going forward, how can they be involved in the conversation? How can they be involved as implementers of some of these recommendations? And just to be clear, they've been working many women's rights organisations on this agenda for a long time. So how can they be involved in a conversation that's building on their expertise and experience? But also then thinking about the role of accountability, and you mentioned about lobbying, for example, for tax cuts, and we know that civil society, along with women's organisations, as one of the groups identified in the report, may have a key role in that as well. So it's a really question of how that can be all brought into a conversation on the high-level panel going forward. Not one I have the answer to right now, but one that we can maybe discuss more going forward. And with that, I would like to move us now on to the question and answer. We have had a few questions in already over the web forum. So I think what I'm going to do is have a look through and take them in groups of about 2 or 3. I think what I'll do is pose those to the panel in their group, and then I'll call on you one by one, if you don't mind, to answer those, just given that we're obviously liaising from different places, so I think that's probably the clearest way of doing it. And just the usual kind of caveat to our panelists, we want to get as many questions in as possible, so please do try and keep your answers as succinct and to the point as possible. So let me just have a look at the questions that we've had coming in. We've had one from Chandran A from Bangalore in India. How can CSR influence women in providing economic independence? Can you suggest real workable solutions for the private sector? We've also had one from Arjun Dahan. Don't have a location on that one. The comment there for Jenny. Great presentation, Jenny. Thanks very much. The multifaceted nature of constraints and actions is very well taken. What thoughts do you have on how an agenda and the organisations or coalitions can address this complexity? So that's actually a question I think that several members of the panel might be able to pick up on, given the broad range of the discussion. And I've got another question, just bear with me. I've got another question in here from Jane Turner. How does the report consider and make proposals around the most marginalised women, for example, women with disabilities? So in your answers, colleagues, it would be great if you could think about, reflect on perhaps what's in the content of the report, but also, in terms of practically what these questions imply for an agenda going forward. I think, seeing as we've got some that are quite pointed at the content of the report, I'm going to hand over to Jenny first. So if you could just make a few reflections on that, and then we'll hear from the other members of the panel.
Can you hear me? So I'll respond to those questions, but I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Jessica said, because it was great to get kind of the overall feedback, but I think there are a couple of things that she said which actually weren't correct. She said that human rights were not valued for their own intrinsically, that the focus was too much on the economic case. But let me just read 2 sentences. Why is women's economic empowerment so important? This is on page 14. Women's economic empowerment and gender equality are first and foremost about basic human rights. The panel's report and recommendations are grounded in the human rights foundations of the 2030 Agenda and build on international human rights and labour conventions laws and norms. The centrality of human rights has guided the panel's work and is reflected in its commitments and recommendations. So I'm not sure where that was coming from for Jessica, but human rights is kind of the first and foremost justification for the focus on women's economic empowerment. So I just wanted to clarify that point in case others pick that up without actually looking at the report. And then just on the fiscal space point, we do have quite a focus as well in Chapter 1 on the importance of budget allocations, that policymakers should recognise that reductions in public spending, including on health, education, social services and social protection, are especially damaging for women, that women are more likely than men to work in the public sector, that the gender effects of budgetary cuts have been largely overlooked or underestimated by governments. And then we cite research that had been supported by the ITUC, the importance of public investment, ongoing work by the IMF and others on gender budgeting. So clearly, you know, there is more to be said on the macro front, and it may well be that the second report pursues this in greater depth, but I do want to dispel the notion that it wasn't addressed at all in the report. In fact, it's included there. And then finally, I think it's important to recognise that the report itself is addressing a number of structural barriers. Structural barriers are not the same as macroeconomic policy. Structural barriers include, for example, the legal constraints which prevent women from working or limit them to certain parts of activities. Structural constraints are those which shape norms and attitudes, which again affect their choices and opportunities in the labour market. So we do address indeed a whole range of structural barriers and structural constraints in the report. And that's indeed the focus of much of Chapter 2 in terms of the diagnostics, and then Chapter 3 in terms of the way forward. What Chapter 4 does is lay out what the panelists themselves were prepared to commit to doing in this first report. Clearly it was very time constrained, as a number of you have pointed out. There was a diversity of actors on the panel. And so the extent to which you know, the agenda is actually pushed forward kind of varies across different actors in terms of the scope of what they're able to undertake, their mandates and so on. You know, some of them are large and complex organisations which require more time in order to be able to make decisions and commitments and push the agenda forward. So clearly that's an important aspect of the report, and I hope it's one that is pushed forward in the period ahead. Thanks to Ahan for the question around kind of partnerships and how this should be done. And I think that there are already emerging some interesting collaborations around the agenda. So, for example, WeGo, the group organising informal workers and working with informal workers, men and women, but very much with disadvantaged women as well, is collaborating, for example, with the Mozilla Foundation and looking at the ways in which digital inclusion can be used to push forward the agenda, including around kind of voice and organisation. There are a number of other examples of partnerships among panellists. For example, the UK government working with the government of Tanzania, for example. The IMF working with others in terms of the work it's doing on the macro side. So there are specific examples. We don't have a, if you like, a template or a kind of generic approach. It's very much kind of case by case and kind of testing what works and how to accelerate progress. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. If I can move now to Mekala for your responses.
Great. So I'll pick up on where Jenny left off on the agenda and the coalitions, agenda for the coalitions rather. I do feel like this is quite, and Abigail, you alluded to this in your remarks, this is actually coalitions across multiple stakeholders, I think has the potential to be very powerful, but is also obviously quite challenging to implement. So as I was mentioning that, we at the McKinsey Global Institute are starting to tee up conversations across a few of our local offices on potential cross-sector collaborations involving private sector, social sector, as well as public sector. But I think the fundamental philosophy around which these coalitions need to be anchored is twofold. One is the idea that bringing members of the coalition together, bringing these cross-sector collaborations together actually has the potential to accelerate progress in a way that action by individual actors does not. And then the second is this idea of shared value, which is that each of the members of the coalition actually is able to do something differently or is able to benefit from the coalition in a way that they wouldn't be able to through individual action. And I think as we have each of these conversations, we are engaged in a very explicit dialogue with individual stakeholders on these 2 points, because I think partnerships and coalitions for the sake of partnerships and coalitions really doesn't achieve anything. So, and as I was describing, I think there is increased energy now towards these partnerships and coalitions. So while we may not, at the end of 6 months or a year, arrive at a single silver bullet template for how to make coalitions work, maybe what we could develop is a set of paradigms or principles or just ways to think about coalition and shared value that could inform the next higher level panel report or could inform actions by the panel members going forward. To the point around CSR, what we have found works best with CSR and how private sector companies think about CSR is a core alignment between CSR efforts and the actions of the business model and the products and services that each individual company offers. So, for example, Allstate, an insurance company in a financial services company in the United States, had a foundation which now, incidentally, it is in the process of spinning off. But it was a foundation that was devoted to financial inclusion and financial independence for survivors of violence. So that was a clear alignment between Allstate's core skill set, core business model, and what they were seeking to do with their philanthropy. And I think more and more this is how private sector foundations are being set up and are trying to develop synergies between their core profit-making arm and their foundation arm, and that's really one of the key drivers for success of such CSR efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Just, a quick reflection there. I think, what's quite interesting from what you're saying is actually about bringing out people's core business model, which is ultimately in many cases going to be their strength. So actually finding ways to use people's expertise and their strength, from the sounds of it, can only actually add value of them in these partnerships. I'm going to move on now to Jessica. Can I bring you now for your responses? And then following that, we I think have time for one more round of questions. So I'll be looking out to see what's come in. So just before we, sorry Jessica, just before we moved on, if there's any last questions that anybody is burning to ask out there online, please do send them through now. Thanks, Jessica, over to you.
Okay, thanks. I think most of the questions have been answered, but I just wanted to pick up on the one about the most marginalized women and women with disabilities, because I think that's one of the things that we have to be careful about, and I think the report on the whole does this, is not equating female labour force participation with women's economic empowerment, and that for some women they aren't able to work, and that we have to find other ways in which they have economic security. And the report does mention some bits on social protection, but perhaps looking forward we could think about that a bit more. There is mention about informal employment as well, but I think that there probably is space, I think, going forward to really focus on what women's economic empowerment means for the most marginalised, and focusing not only on paid employment. Can I also just clarify on some of the points Jenny made, Jenny, which was that what I was saying was that my concern is that some of the things that are in the report are not making it through to the call to action. So yes, there's my point really was that yes, there's some really important language in there about the importance of rights, but actually on page 8, one of the 7 principles is an equal focus on rights and gains. And I was hoping that actually the principle might be a primary focus on the importance of women's rights rather than an equal focus. As you mentioned, there is some stuff about the importance of public spending, and I think you quoted one of the references on page 18, and I think actually you pulled out the same 4 or 5 that I'd pulled out. But those don't really come through in the call to action. And yes, of course, there's mention of structural barriers, particularly in terms of legal, but my point was that the economic structural barriers, I think, receive less attention, and they're not identified either as one of the constraints or as one of the 7 drivers. So it would be good going forward, I think, if there could be more attention on that.
Thank you, Jessica. And is possibly always the way now. We're having the questions coming in thick and fast. I think what I'm going to do, if you just bear with me a moment, they are coming in live as we speak. What I'm going to do is try and group them together a little bit, because we've got a couple that speak to some of the to some quite similar points. We've got a couple of questions here around, what comes next, and we've heard some talk that there's going to be a second high-level panel report. So I'm having some kind of queries about, what are the plans for the second report and how will it differ from the first? And something quite specific in the questions here about whether there'll be new pledges from panelists and others in the new report. We're talking a lot here about what still needs to be done, so that's a question there about, whether we're expecting another set of pledges. I've had a question in here which links, I think, quite well to this discussion between Jenny and Jessica around the human rights agenda. And the question's from Malu Schuller, and it's about how do we better, in practical terms, link the discussion between the business and human rights communities and wider agenda. And she's making the observation that they often seem delinked. Women's rights are currently lacking in the business and human rights agenda. For example, the guiding principles on business and human rights, national action plans on business and human rights, are 2 examples that have been given to me there. So just the question really there is on about actually what can we do then to possibly better link them. I'm just going to move to a third question. Well, we've got a bit of a meaty one here. I think this will have to be the last one. Question from Laura Kurtze. Apologies to everyone for, I'm sure, the wrong pronunciations for everyone's names. We've got a question here from Laura. Many thanks for the insights so far. I'd be very keen to hear the speaker's views on how to increase women's economic participation, in particular in contexts that are characterized by already tense labour markets, high unemployment, and difficulties creating sufficient employment opportunities. So I think with that, we'll see how we get on with the answers. But I would again make a plea to the panelists to keep your answers as informative yet succinct as possible, because I would like to give you all a chance to come in with your own final reflections at the end. I think we'll go in a slightly different order this time, if that's okay. I'll call on Nicola first with your reflections on those questions.
So on the what comes next, I think Jenny is best positioned to answer that. I already shared in my remarks some thoughts on what the panel can consider going forward. I think this last question around how tense labor market situations, really labor market situations where job creation is a challenge, how to think about women's economic empowerment in such a scenario. I do feel like a lot of what we've discussed and how we've thought about women's economic empowerment does apply equally to such labor market scenarios. So, for example, thinking about decent work for women as well as men, thinking about better balancing paid and unpaid work, thinking about an adequate minimum wage for both men and women. I think all of that equally applies to such labor market situations. And I would actually say that fundamental to all the debate about women's economic empowerment is the point that Jessica made, which is women's economic empowerment is not just about women's economic empowerment. And a lot of the policies and the actions we're describing here for women's economic empowerment equally apply to men. Some of our work has shown, for example, the link between inequality in labor force participation between men and women tends to be high in countries that agree with the question, when jobs are scarce, they should go to men. But I would argue that in such situations, it's almost more important to think about equitable distribution of talent in jobs and ensuring that both men and women have the opportunity to access jobs, and we're really trying to encourage and enable the best talent to be employed in the workforce. I think separately, as I was alluding to my remarks, there's a whole different side of this equation, which is how to spur demand and job creation. And I think that would obviously be something that is relevant and important to consider in such situations. But I will pause now and hand over to the other participants, other panelists.
Thank you very much. I will come now to Jessica for some brief remarks. Thank you.
Okay, just 2 points. One was on the kind of human rights issue, the question about that. I think one of the key things is that in judging the efficacy of measures, we need to look at the impact on women's rights, not the impact on economic gains. So that, for example, might lead us to look at the quality of employment and decent work rather than just the absolute numbers of women in the labour force. On the question about going forward, which is obviously mainly for Jenny, but I did just want to flag up what I hope will happen going forward, which is I think there's a danger that the panel is focusing on what each panelist will do as its contribution, which is good, people putting their money where their mouth is, but that after all the panelists are a small number of entities, and that in fact I think it would be good to look up a bit from that daily grind and think about how to shift future agendas, but also I think how to raise the necessary funds. And again, coming back to the point that I do think needs to be in the next report or whatever comes next is what is business's contribution to raising the funds, and where's the fiscal policy, what are governments going to do?
Thank you. I think you touched on another one of our questions that we had in that I'm afraid I didn't have time to pose, which is about saying this is a long-term agenda and change doesn't happen overnight. So what will be the kind of galvanizing force outside the high-level panel members themselves following this and the second report? Jenny, I'm going to hand over to you. There was a question, I think, about the plans for the second report and the work of the panel going forward, which I think you were probably best placed to answer. But please do feel free to pick up on the other questions as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And thanks again for the opportunity this morning or this afternoon, depending upon where you're located. On the second report, I'm actually not very well placed to tell you what's going to happen. I don't think that's been fully determined. I think that the advice of Jessica and others as to kind of where the value added might be of this panel as a high-level panel is well taken. The Secretariat itself is best placed to respond to that. What I can tell you is that it's planned for March of next year, when the Commission of Status on the Status of Women is also having a focus on work in terms of the theme of the Commission, the gathering in New York. On business and human rights, I think that's an important point. We do have a number, I think, of encouraging examples in the report in Chapter 3, pages 75 through 80, which include, for example, Behind the Brands, the work of Oxfam in looking at supply chains of large food companies, multinationals, and how they work and treat workers in their supply chains. The Better Work program of the ILO and the IFC, I think, has some good examples. And here we can actually see, I think, kind of rights-based approaches in action and how they have evolved over time. But I think as a number of people have already underlined, this is very much a long-term agenda. So looking to see kind of what's in play, what seems to work, what seems to make a difference in terms of kind of transparency, collective organisation, lobbying, holding different actors to account, I think is all important in terms of informing the way forward. But thanks again for the opportunity, and I hope that many of you have a chance to, or are now at least inspired to dip into the report itself. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm just going to come back one last time to each of the panelists in turn. Just given, you know, the very wide-ranging discussion we've had, just to give you an opportunity to think if there's any really brief, within 30 seconds, kind of last comments that you would like to make, any kind of key takeaway messages that you would like to make following this. And I'm afraid I will have to be very brief on this, give you just around 30 seconds each, which I know is not an easy challenge. Jessica, I'll come to you first, please.
Okay, it's governments who ultimately have responsibility for implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and this report, at least initially, was in the context of the SDGs. And so I think the one thing I would want to say is that we need to see more about the roles and responsibilities of governments within achieving women's economic empowerment as we go forward.
This is Jenny. I think what my final words would be to encourage those of you who are committed to advancing the agenda to see how you can use the high-level panel report itself, not necessarily in its totality, but in different respects, in order to be able to accelerate the progress that's needed. We're also going to be publishing various of the background work which was done, and policy briefs and so on. And so I very much hope that this is useful for you in your work. The panel is kind of an exercise which is designed to accelerate progress, but I think that kind of building coalitions and people utilizing, adapting, kind of pursuing the agenda in ways that they're able to, and drawing on the report as it's useful in their work, is something which I hope takes place in the period ahead.
Let's turn to Mekala.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to just end by thanking ODI and thanking Jenny and Jessica for this great session. I learned a lot from hearing your remarks. I think the two things I would leave this conversation with: one, I do think that the report has done a phenomenal job to present a nuanced a view of this very complex issue, covering multiple aspects of the issue, covering multiple stakeholders. So I would echo Jenny's comments about really using the findings of the report and using the recommendations of the report as going forward. And I think that the role of the panel itself is one part of what this report can do, but I think much more importantly is how the findings from this report are used by organizations around the world going forward. I think the second thing I would say, and I mentioned this earlier, but as we look to the next report or to the actions of the panel over the course of the next year, I think some themes to continue to explore is, one, how Goal 5 fits into the broader suite of SDGs, because I think it is important to now take a step back and contextualize this in the broader frame of actions that governments need to pursue towards the SDGs. And then secondly is really highlighting what this means from an investment perspective, from a role that each of the individual stakeholders need to play in driving that investment, and how coalitions can best enable that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. You know, we do appreciate you taking time out in what I'm sure are very, very busy schedules. So really do appreciate your participation with us today. Thank you to our online audience who have joined us. You know, I think this is what we've really tried to do here, is create a space in which people can join online. Of course, not everybody else is able to get online, but you know, we were hoping to really kind of take this discussion out of our space here in London and provide an opportunity for those of us that haven't been involved so much in the high-level panel discussion to have an opportunity to hear from different viewpoints. So I hope that's been enjoyable to you. You know, we've had a really broad-ranging discussion. In the few minutes available to me, I'm not going to attempt to repeat or sum up what we've done. But just to kind of highlight a couple of things going forward, you know, the high-level panel report, as we've heard, was set up a suite of potential actions for people involved in the women's economic empowerment agenda to take. You know, and actually there's a question about, you know, how do we make sure that that gets done? I think, you know, it's really positive within the report that the high-level panel members themselves have set a precedent and are really kind of leading by example and creating what feels like a very positive environment, saying, look, you know, actually we are also doing this, let's get behind it. But, you know, on the other side, and not to put it in opposition, but, you know, there's also a question about this fitting within the wider SDG framework, and, you know, how do we make sure that this stuff happens? You know, there's a kind of accountability question there. And, you know, some of those same actors may be involved in that. So, you know, it's a bit of push and pull, might well be the way that this gets to happen. But, you know, one thing's for sure is that, you know, it's absolutely fantastic that the founding members of the panel took this initiative and that this conversation is going on. You know, to a certain extent is, you know, very unprecedented to have such a high-level and broad-based membership panel paying such attention to issues of women's empowerment and gender equality. So I think that is something that we all can certainly celebrate. So I think I'm going to leave it on that. Thank you once again for joining us. As I mentioned, the documents, the high-level panel report, Jenny's presentation, and reports from each of our panelists should have been available to you on the right of the screen. We would like to continue the conversation with you all, so please do feel free to continue to engage on Twitter with the hashtag, which I am told is Women's Economic Empowerment, and I believe that's the hashtag that is linked also into the high-level panel conversation, so hopefully that would also link in there. So all that's left for me to do is wish you a very nice morning, day or evening, depending on where you are. And we really do hope that you'll join us again in an ODI webinar very soon. Thank you.